Deadly hello, if you're still alive, please click on the red subscribe button below the video. Gloomy viewing.
He woke up to an unsettling stillness. The usual noise from the street outside was absent, and there was no faint hum of traffic. The silence was overwhelming. He rubbed his eyes, half expecting the usual morning chaos, the neighbor's dog barking, the distant whir of a lawnmower, his phone buzzing with work messages. He lived in a relatively small town where everyone knew each other, so this complete absence of familiar sounds was jarring. Everything seemed unusually quiet, and the usual morning soundtrack so predictable and comforting was conspicuously missing. He attempted to dismiss the unsettling feeling, hoping that it was just a fleeting anomaly. He brewed his coffee, letting the warm aroma fill the air, but even the scent of the coffee couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. He reached for his phone, hoping to see some sign of normalcy in the form of messages or notifications. Instead, he found an empty screen. There were no messages, no alerts, not even the usual spam emails that cluttered his inbox. This was strange. He checked the time, then scrolled through the news, but the headlines were mundane and unchanging. It felt as though the world had gone dark overnight, yet everything appeared to be in its usual place. The silence seemed almost too profound, as though something fundamental had shifted. His routine, which normally provided a sense of predictability, was now overshadowed by an eerie calm. He could not shake the feeling that something significant had happened, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. In the quiet, the absence of the usual morning noise became a glaring anomaly, prompting him to question what might have gone wrong. The familiar surroundings felt alien, and the usual markers of a normal day were conspicuously absent. The stillness was not just a lack of sound but a deeper, more profound absence that tugged at his sense of reality. He brewed his coffee as usual, letting the comforting aroma spread through the kitchen. The rich scent was meant to soothe him, to anchor him in his daily routine, but today it did little to dispel the nagging sense that something was wrong. He reached for his phone, hoping to find some normalcy in the form of messages or notifications. Instead, the screen greeted him with emptiness. No messages. No notifications. Not even the usual spam emails that he had come to expect. He glanced at the time, noting how it seemed to tick by in a vacuum of silence. He turned to the news, scrolling through article after article. The headlines were mundane, and there were no breaking stories or updates. It was as though the world had simply gone dark overnight. Despite the lack of news and the eerie quiet, everything around him remained in its usual place. The coffee maker, the dishes drying in the rack, the newspaper on the counter all seemed perfectly normal, but the absence of the usual buzz of activity made them feel strangely out of context. The sense of disquiet grew as he continued to search for answers. The calmness that normally accompanied his morning routine now felt hollow, a veneer over something much more unsettling. It was as if the usual markers of reality had been erased, leaving only an unsettling void where normal life should have been. The stillness in the air was tangible, pressing in on him from all sides, making every familiar object seem foreign and distant. He tried to convince himself that it was simply an anomaly, a strange but harmless glitch in his morning routine. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this silence was more than just an absence of sound. It was a sign something was terribly wrong, and he had yet to uncover what it might be. He decided to call his brother. His brother, ever the concerned sibling, had a habit of checking in on him every few days, often nagging him to get out more, meet new people, and stop being such a recluse. It was a pattern he had grown accustomed to, and it was always a source of comfort, a reminder that there was someone out there who cared. This morning, however, his call went straight to voicemail. The familiar voice greeting him was dispassionate, almost cold. It struck him as strange and unnerving. His stomach tightened with unease. He tried to push the worry aside, convincing himself that his brother might just be unavailable or his phone could be on silent. With a growing sense of dread, he dialed his mother's number next, hoping that her warm, reassuring voice would offer some semblance of normalcy. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. His calls to her were usually met with immediate responses, her voice always a steady presence in his life. But today, the line was met with silence, intensifying his anxiety. He could feel the unease gnawing at him with increasing intensity. Each unanswered call, each instance of silence, was like another piece of the puzzle falling into place, revealing a picture he was not yet ready to comprehend. The quiet of his surroundings had already unsettled him, but the lack of contact with his closest family members pushed his anxiety to a new level. It was as though the very fabric of his reality was unraveling, and he was left to piece together a troubling mystery with only silence as his guide. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. If his family wasn't reachable, then perhaps someone else might be able to shed light on the situation. He had to find answers, to understand what was happening to his world. With a growing sense of urgency, he resolved to head to his mother's house, hoping that there he might find the answers he so desperately needed. He decided to head to his mother's house. Although he no longer lived with her, she had always been his safe haven when things felt off-kilter. Her house was located in a small, cozy neighborhood not far from where he was. The drive was usually quick, a simple commute across town. As he drove, he noticed something increasingly unsettling. The streets, which would normally have been filled with the usual morning activity, were eerily deserted. There were no children playing, no cars passing by, not even the occasional jogger he had come to expect. The silence was palpable, amplifying his sense of unease. He passed by houses with their doors standing wide open and cars idling in driveways, yet there was no sign of life. It was as if people had simply vanished, leaving everything behind in a sudden, panicked rush. It struck him as surreal, the empty streets and abandoned homes painting a picture of a world frozen in time. Trying to lighten the mood, he made a joke to himself, did the apocalypse happen without me? Am I the only survivor? He chuckled uneasily, but the humor felt hollow, a thin veneer over his growing anxiety. The quiet streets and deserted homes only deepened his sense of dread, transforming his once familiar neighborhood into a scene of eerie desolation. As he continued driving, the feeling of isolation grew more intense. The emptiness around him was becoming overwhelming, and the joke he had made seemed less and less amusing. He needed to reach his mother's house, hoping that her presence or at least some clue about what was going on would offer him the answers he desperately sought. When he arrived at his mother's house, an immediate sense of wrongness enveloped him. The front door was ajar, slightly open as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside, the TV was still on, its flickering light casting strange shadows on the walls. Yet, there was no sign of his mother. The house felt strangely deserted, its usual warmth replaced by an unsettling emptiness. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the quiet rooms as he called out for her. "Mom? Are you here?" His voice seemed to dissipate into the void, swallowed by the silence that pervaded the house. In the living room, her knitting supplies were spread out on the armchair as if she had just left them there. The yarn was tangled in a way that suggested she had been working on a project moments before. On the kitchen counter, a coffee cup sat half full, its contents now cold and untouched. The sight of these small, personal items, the knitting, the coffee cup, served as stark reminders of her sudden absence. He moved from room to room, checking every corner of the house. Each room was as still and empty as the last. Despite his efforts to find any sign of her, she was nowhere to be found. The house, usually filled with her presence and routine, felt like a shell of its former self. The more he searched, the more the feeling of dread grew. The house was a familiar place, yet it now seemed foreign and unsettling. The absence of his mother, combined with the disconcerting quiet and the signs of her abrupt departure, left him feeling increasingly anxious. The unease he had felt earlier now seemed to crystallize into a full-blown panic. What could have happened to her? Why was everything left in such disarray? The growing realization that something was seriously amiss pressed heavily on him. He needed answers, and he hoped that somewhere, somehow, there would be a clue that could explain the strange, disquieting events unfolding around him. He sank into the couch, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence pressing down on him. The once comforting familiarity of his mother's living room now felt alien and oppressive. The absence of her presence was almost palpable, and the silence seemed to fill every inch of the space, magnifying his sense of isolation. It wasn't just his mother who was missing, the entire neighborhood felt eerily deserted. The usual hum of daily life that once characterized the area was gone, replaced by a disconcerting emptiness. He couldn't shake the unsettling thought that this pervasive silence and absence were somehow linked to his work. The more he reflected on the situation, the more the connections began to form in his mind. His recent dreams had been filled with strange and unsettling visions of people vanishing, and now it seemed that this was not just a figment of his imagination but a reality. The experiments at his lab, the malfunction, the inexplicable phenomena, everything was converging into a troubling pattern. The strange occurrences at work, the experiments with teleportation and dimensional rifts seemed to be intertwined with the current situation. The dreams of people disappearing, the odd sensations he had been experiencing, and now the complete absence of life around him pointed to a disturbing possibility: his work might be the cause of this surreal phenomenon. The realization gnawed at him, deepening his anxiety. He had always thought of himself as a small part of a larger project, someone who simply kept the lights on while others conducted groundbreaking research. But now, it appeared that he might be at the center of something much larger and far more troubling than he had ever imagined. Sitting in the dimly lit room, he felt a surge of panic and helplessness. The evidence of his mother's sudden departure and the empty streets outside made it clear that something profound had shifted. The connection to his work, once abstract and distant, now loomed over him as a frightening reality. The world seemed to be unraveling, and he was caught in the middle of a disturbing, inexplicable event. The last few weeks at the lab had been nothing short of intense. They had been working on a high-level experiment, one that involved cutting-edge technology and concepts that were both fascinating and bewildering. The project revolved around teleportation, perhaps even delving into the realm of dimensional rifts. The implications were staggering. It was said that their work could revolutionize everything humanity understood about space and time. Despite the groundbreaking nature of the project, he had been kept largely in the dark. His role was more mundane, a background figure in a grand experiment. His primary responsibility was to ensure that the facilities operated smoothly, keeping the lights on, managing equipment, handling routine tasks. He was just a regular guy trying to make a living, a cog in a much larger machine. However, things took a dramatic turn when a malfunction occurred in one of the underground labs. There was a sudden and unexpected problem. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the entire facility was shut down. The exact nature of the malfunction was beyond his scope of knowledge, but it was clear that it was significant enough to warrant an immediate halt to the experiment. In the days following the shutdown, he began to experience the strangest dreams. They were vivid and disconcerting, filled with images of people vanishing into thin air. The dreams were unsettling, leaving him with a sense of foreboding that lingered long after he woke. He had tried to dismiss them as the product of stress and fatigue, but the increasing frequency and intensity of these dreams made it hard to ignore their connection to the recent events at the lab. Now, as he sat in his mother's empty house, the connection between the lab's malfunction and the inexplicable disappearance of people seemed impossible to ignore. The unsettling dreams, the sudden and eerie emptiness in his surroundings, it all pointed to a troubling possibility. Something had gone terribly wrong with the experiment, and its effects were rippling outward, impacting the world in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The weight of this realization pressed heavily upon him. The lab's experiment, which had seemed like a distant, abstract concept, was now at the forefront of a disturbing reality. The once theoretical notions of teleportation and dimensional rifts had now manifested into a tangible, frightening phenomenon. As he grappled with these thoughts, he felt a growing urgency to understand what had happened, to find a way to fix it, and to discover if there was any hope of reversing the damage that had been done. With a heavy heart, he left his mother's house, feeling the weight of the empty silence that lingered behind him. Before he left, he scribbled a quick note, hoping against hope that she might return and see it. "Mom, I'm looking for you. Please come back. I'm worried." He left it where she would easily find it, then drove to his brother's apartment, clinging to the hope that his brother might have some answers. The drive felt interminable, each mile intensifying his sense of unease. When he arrived at his brother's place, he was met with yet another unsettling sight. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly open as though it had been left in haste. Inside, the apartment bore the marks of a sudden departure. The lights were still on, casting a stark contrast to the pervasive silence of the outside world. In the kitchen, half-eaten food sat abandoned on the table. His brother's phone was on the counter, with his number dialed in. It was as if his brother had left in a rush, perhaps intending to make a call but never completing it. The scene was both ordinary and deeply disconcerting, a snapshot of normal life interrupted by something catastrophic. His brother's car was parked outside, a familiar sight that made the absence of its owner even more glaring. The car was parked as if it had been left just moments ago, its presence a stark reminder of the inexplicable emptiness that had taken over. He walked through the apartment, calling out for his brother with no response. The rooms were as deserted as the rest of the town, filled with the mundane objects of everyday life but devoid of any signs of the person who once occupied them. It was becoming increasingly clear that his brother was gone, just like everyone else. The realization hit him with a heavy thud. The connections he had been trying to piece together now seemed to come into sharper focus. The malfunction at the lab, the disappearing people, the sudden absence of his loved ones, all of it was converging into a grim and troubling reality. Desperate and disoriented, he sank into a chair in the living room, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. The sense of isolation and dread grew stronger, and he knew he needed to find out what had caused this catastrophe. There were no more places to turn for answers except for the lab where everything had started. He was beginning to grasp the chilling truth. This was not a mere coincidence or an isolated incident. The strange dreams, the malfunction at the lab, and the inexplicable disappearances, it was all converging into a disturbing reality. He was at the epicenter of something far beyond his initial comprehension, something that seemed to intertwine his own existence with the sudden vanishing of those around him. Yet, despite the fragments of understanding that were falling into place, the full scope of what had happened remained maddeningly elusive. As he sat in his brother's apartment, grappling with the weight of these revelations, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. It was a fleeting movement, barely perceptible but enough to stir his curiosity. He glanced outside, trying to discern what had caught his attention. There, in the distance, near the edge of an open field just beyond the edge of town, he saw them. At first, it was just a flicker of figures against the horizon. As he focused, he realized they were people standing in the middle of the field, seemingly waiting or watching. His heart raced with a mix of hope and trepidation. Finally, other people. Maybe they had answers, or at least some semblance of normalcy. He grabbed his binoculars from the car, his hands trembling as he peered through the lenses. The figures were not numerous, perhaps 5 or 6 people, but they were undeniably human, and they were there. He waved frantically, desperate for any sign of acknowledgement. But the people stood unmoving, their faces turned away from him, their posture tense and uneasy. They seemed to be huddled together, whispering among themselves, their body language reflecting anxiety and fear. He stepped out of the apartment and made his way toward them, his movements driven by a mix of urgency and hope. As he approached the edge of the field, he raised his hand again, trying to catch their attention. The closer he got, the more apparent their discomfort became. One man kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to chase him at any moment. Then, as he took a single step forward, something horrifying happened. One of the women in the group suddenly vanished. It wasn't gradual or slow, she simply disappeared, as if she had been erased from existence. The space where she had been standing was now empty, her sudden absence causing an immediate and palpable panic among the remaining figures. He took another step forward, and in a moment of disoriented confusion, he saw another person disappear in the same abrupt manner. The remaining individuals, now gripped by sheer terror, began to flee. They bolted away from him, trying to escape the invisible threat that seemed to be chasing them. He stood frozen, his mind reeling from the sight. Each step he took closer to the edge of the field seemed to cause more people to vanish. The reality of his situation hit him with a crushing force. Whatever force was at play, it was somehow connected to him, and his proximity was causing these people to disappear. The weight of his realization was unbearable. The experiments at the lab, the dreams, the sudden absence of people, it was all converging into a horrifying truth. He was at the center of this catastrophe, and his presence was causing the disappearance of those around him. Desperation and dread washed over him as he stumbled back, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding before him. The full impact of his involvement was dawning on him with frightening clarity. He was no longer just a bystander, he was part of something that defied all understanding, and the consequences of this reality were far more profound and terrifying than he had ever imagined. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, barely noticeable from the corner of his eye. He had been sitting in his car, still reeling from the disturbing events, when he caught sight of something shifting in the distance. Driven by a surge of hope and curiosity, he pulled the car over to the side of the road and fumbled with the glove compartment, retrieving the binoculars he had kept stashed there. His hands trembled as he raised the binoculars to his eyes, his heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. As he focused on the horizon, his breath caught in his throat. There, near the edge of a large, open field, he saw them people. They were standing in a small group, perhaps 5 or 6 individuals, their figures silhouetted against the backdrop of the open space. The sight of them was a rare and precious beacon of hope amidst the overwhelming emptiness. Their presence was a stark contrast to the deserted streets and abandoned homes he had encountered earlier. The group was clustered together, their body language suggesting a mix of vigilance and unease. They seemed to be waiting or observing something, their heads occasionally turning toward the distant horizon. He scanned them more closely through the binoculars. They appeared to be ordinary people, their clothing and posture hinting at a range of backgrounds and ages. Despite the distance, he could see that they were anxious, their movements and expressions betraying a deep sense of fear or apprehension. He waved his arms, trying to catch their attention. "Hey! Can you see me?" He shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the vast expanse of the field. The people remained unmoving, their focus seemingly fixed on something beyond his view. Desperate for a response, he grabbed his phone, attempting to dial their number in the hope of reaching them. The connection was tenuous, and his growing frustration made him aware of how surreal and fragmented his situation had become. As he prepared to get out of the car and approach the field, the weight of the silence and the isolation pressed heavily upon him. The once faint hope now felt tinged with the fear of what he might find. The inexplicable disappearances and the connection to his own actions had left him feeling both determined and fearful. He made his way toward the field, his steps slow and deliberate. Each step seemed to stretch into an eternity as he approached the group, his mind racing with questions and fears. What had happened to these people? Were they aware of the same reality he was grappling with? The need for answers drove him forward, despite the gnawing dread that accompanied each step. The distance between him and the group closed, but their response remained elusive. The field seemed to stretch endlessly, and the closer he got, the more he felt a sense of foreboding. As he neared the edge of the field, the anxiety of what he might discover became almost unbearable. His heart pounded with a mixture of hope and trepidation as he approached the group in the field. Finally, other people. The sight of them felt like a lifeline, a sign that he wasn't alone in this nightmarish situation. He waved vigorously, his desperation for a connection evident in the frantic gestures. "Hey! Can you hear me? Can you see me?" He shouted, but his calls were met with an unsettling silence. None of the figures acknowledged him or responded to his attempts to make contact. The group stood clustered together, their bodies tense and their heads turning frequently as if expecting something or someone. They were clearly on edge, their posture rigid and their eyes darting around nervously. The sense of unease was palpable, and it struck him as odd. These people were not just waiting or watching, they seemed to be bracing themselves for an imminent threat. Through the binoculars, he observed their behavior more closely. They weren't merely passive observers, they were actively shifting their weight from foot to foot, whispering urgently among themselves. One man in particular stood out. He was frequently glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting to see something or someone coming up behind him. His anxious glances and the way he shifted nervously suggested a high level of fear or paranoia. The group's collective anxiety was almost tangible, and it only added to the growing sense of foreboding. The man's constant looking back and the hushed, urgent whispers among the others indicated that they were dealing with a situation far more complex and dangerous than he had initially thought. He took another step forward, trying to gauge their reaction. The closer he got, the more pronounced their discomfort became. They seemed to be shrinking back from him, their nervousness intensifying with each movement he made. The field, which had once seemed like a promising avenue for answers, now felt like a trap, and the group's fearful behavior was a stark reminder of how little he understood about the true nature of the crisis unfolding around him. His mind raced with questions. What were they afraid of? Why weren't they responding to him? Were they aware of something that he wasn't? The tension in the air was almost suffocating, and he struggled to piece together the fragmented clues that were becoming increasingly alarming. With a deep breath, he tried to steady himself, forcing himself to remain calm despite the rising anxiety. The group's behavior was unsettling, but it only strengthened his resolve to find out what was happening. He needed answers, and the people in the field might hold the key to understanding the strange and terrifying reality he had found himself in. As he took another cautious step closer, the atmosphere grew more charged with fear, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay ahead was going to test him in ways he could barely imagine. He stepped out of the car, his mind set on making contact with the group. Raising his hand once more, he tried to signal them, hoping to bridge the gap of silence and fear that lay between them. His movements were deliberate, intended to show that he meant no harm, but the reaction he received was anything but reassuring. As he approached the edge of the field, the group's unease only grew more pronounced. One by one, they began to retreat, slowly backing away from him as if he were a threat. Their fearful eyes followed his every move, their bodies tensing with each step he took closer. It was a disconcerting sight the way they were pulling away, their actions almost instinctual, as though they were driven by a deep, primal fear. It felt wrong. The manner in which they were retreating seemed charged with an inexplicable dread, as if his very presence was causing them distress. Each step he took seemed to push them further away, their fear growing more palpable with every inch he closed. He took a single step forward, trying to close the distance and make sense of their behavior. That's when it happened. In an instant, one of the women in the group vanished. There was no warning, no gradual fading, she simply disappeared, as though she had been erased from existence. One moment she was standing there, and the next, there was nothing but the empty space where she had been. The suddenness of it left him frozen, his heart pounding wildly. The woman's disappearance was so abrupt, so startling, that it felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. The remaining members of the group reacted with immediate, escalating panic. Their faces went pale, their eyes wide with terror as they witnessed the inexplicable event. The remaining people began to scatter, their attempts to flee becoming frenzied as they rushed away from him and the spot where the woman had disappeared. The field that had seemed like a potential source of answers now felt like a stage for an unfolding nightmare. He stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. The fear and confusion were overwhelming. The reality of the situation was becoming painfully clear, his presence was causing these people to vanish. The connection between the experiments, the strange dreams, and the horrific consequences of his actions was now undeniable. As the last of the group disappeared into the distance, leaving the field eerily empty, he was left grappling with the horrifying realization. The vanishing of the woman, and the way the group had reacted, had made it all too clear that he was at the center of a catastrophe that he couldn't fully understand but was helplessly part of. He staggered back to his car, the weight of his newfound understanding crashing down on him. The field was now silent and empty, a stark testament to the devastating impact of his presence. The fear that had been gnawing at him was now a profound, paralyzing reality. He was alone once again, with no clear path forward, only the chilling knowledge that he was the cause of the disappearances that had plagued his world. She didn't run or hide. She just vanished. One moment she was standing there, part of the group, and the next, she was gone. The space where she had been was suddenly empty, as if she had never existed. The abruptness of her disappearance left him paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the shocking reality. The remaining people in the group saw it too. Their faces went from fear to sheer terror as they realized what had happened. The woman's sudden vanishing had triggered a wave of panic among them. They began to back away, their fear escalating with every passing second. In a moment of confusion and desperation, he took a step closer, his hand still raised in a futile attempt to communicate. The act of moving forward seemed to have a catastrophic effect. As he took another step, one of the remaining individuals vanished in the same inexplicable manner. The others' panic surged, and they turned to flee, their movements frantic and chaotic. The field, which had initially seemed like a place of potential answers, now felt like a nightmarish trap. Each step he took toward the remaining members of the group seemed to draw them closer to the same fate. Their attempts to escape were in vain, no matter how fast they ran, it was too late. One by one, they too began to disappear, fading from existence with each step he took closer. The scene unfolded before him in a surreal and horrifying manner. The once clustered group was now reduced to a series of empty spaces, each marked by the abrupt absence of a person. The fear and chaos that had dominated the field moments before were now replaced by a haunting silence. The sense of isolation he felt grew with each passing second, as he became increasingly aware of the gravity of what was happening. He stood amidst the emptiness, the weight of his actions crushing him. The field was now devoid of human presence, the only evidence of the people who had been there moments ago being the traces of their hurried departure. The silence was deafening, and the realization of what he had done sunk in with an overwhelming force. The connection between the experiments, the strange dreams, and the horrifying consequences was now undeniable. He was the cause of these disappearances, the catalyst for a phenomenon that defied all understanding. The world he had known was unraveling, and he was at the center of the chaos. He staggered back to his car, his mind reeling from the sheer magnitude of his situation. The field, once a place of potential hope, had become a symbol of his profound isolation and the terrifying reality of his existence. The nightmare he had been living through was now starkly clear, and the path forward seemed as elusive as the people who had vanished before his eyes. He suddenly froze, the weight of the revelation hitting him with the force of a freight train. His mind reeled as he dropped the binoculars, the world spinning around him in a disorienting blur. The truth of the situation was dawning on him, and it was both terrifying and undeniable. This wasn't just a bizarre coincidence or a strange phenomenon affecting everyone. This was happening because of him. The realization made him feel physically ill. The experiments at the lab, the malfunction, the unsettling dreams, none of it had been mere figments of his imagination. He had been at the heart of something profoundly dangerous, something that had altered his very existence. The cosmic force they had tapped into during those high-level experiments had transformed him, turning him into a human anomaly, a living black hole. As he stood there, the full gravity of the situation pressed down on him. He wasn't merely a witness to these disappearances, he was their cause. The people who had vanished were not victims of some external force but were being erased from existence whenever he came too close. The realization struck him with a chilling clarity: whatever had gone wrong in the lab had fundamentally changed him, making him a source of the very phenomenon that was now devastating the world around him. The field, once a place where he had hoped to find answers, now seemed like a cruel reminder of his newfound curse. The emptiness that had swallowed the group was a direct result of his presence, and the knowledge that he was the catalyst for these horrifying events left him paralyzed with guilt and dread. He sank to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably. The weight of his actions, the destruction he had inadvertently caused, was almost too much to bear. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he struggled to make sense of what had happened. The experiments had unleashed a force that was beyond his comprehension, and he was now the living embodiment of that force. The field was eerily silent, the stillness broken only by the sound of his own labored breathing. He was alone, isolated by the very power he had become a conduit for. The faces of the people who had vanished flashed in his mind, each one a painful reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. As he struggled to pull himself together, he knew that he had to find a way to make amends, to understand how to reverse the effects of whatever had happened. But the enormity of the situation was daunting, and he was left with a crushing sense of helplessness. He needed to return to the lab, to confront the source of the experiments and seek answers, but the journey seemed insurmountable. The terror of his own existence, the fear of what he might inadvertently do next, kept him rooted in place. He was a walking void, a harbinger of disappearances, and the weight of that knowledge was almost more than he could bear. He staggered back to the car, his heart pounding in his chest as he grappled with the crushing weight of his newfound understanding. The notes he had seen earlier, those cryptic messages left behind, began to make a horrific kind of sense. "Don't come closer. You're not alone, but you need to stay away." They weren't just cryptic warnings to him, they were desperate cautions about him. The realization struck him with a cold, paralyzing clarity. Those notes had been left not as messages for him, but as warnings about his very presence. The people who had been near him had known, or at least suspected, the danger he posed. The gravity of their fear, the urgency in their notes, it was all directed at him, revealing a chilling truth he had been too blind to see until now. His thoughts turned to his mom, his brother, everyone he had been close to in the days leading up to this nightmare. Had he caused their disappearances, too? The guilt that washed over him was overwhelming, a suffocating tide of remorse and despair. He had gone to them seeking comfort, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy and safety amidst the chaos. Instead, he had unwittingly become the instrument of their destruction. Images of his mother's empty house, the frantic search for his brother, each memory now seemed tainted with a new, horrifying significance. He had been so focused on finding answers, on understanding the strange occurrences and his own role in them, that he had failed to see the devastating impact of his actions. The car was now a refuge from the field's emptiness, but it did nothing to alleviate the suffocating guilt he felt. He slumped into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to steady his breathing. The road ahead was unclear, both literally and metaphorically. He had no idea where to go or how to reverse the damage he had caused. As he sat there, the enormity of his situation pressed down on him. He was alone, isolated by a force he couldn't control or fully understand. The weight of the disappearances, the faces of those who had vanished, lingered in his mind like haunting shadows. Each one was a reminder of his own culpability, a stark representation of the destruction that had followed in his wake. The path forward seemed impossible. He needed answers, a way to undo what had been done, but every step he took seemed to deepen the abyss of his despair. The responsibility for the disappearances, the burden of knowing that he was the cause of such suffering, was almost more than he could bear. He had to return to the lab, to confront the source of the experiments and seek a solution, but the fear of what he might do next was paralyzing. The realization that his presence alone could erase people from existence left him with a profound sense of isolation and helplessness. As the silence of the car enveloped him, he knew that he had to find a way to understand and control the force that had changed him, if not for his own sake, then for the sake of those who had been caught in the wake of his unintended destruction. He sank into the driver's seat, staring blankly at the empty field where those people had been only moments ago. The full weight of his predicament crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The once familiar world now seemed alien and hostile. The government experiment, the bizarre energy they had been manipulating, it had done something to him. Something irreversible. And now, he was left alone, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. It wasn't a global collapse, it wasn't an apocalypse. It was something much more personal and terrifying. The realization that the very cause of the disappearances was himself shattered any remaining sense of normalcy. The cosmic force they had tapped into had transformed him into a walking void, a living anomaly capable of erasing anyone who came within his proximity. The field that had been a symbol of hope now felt like a graveyard of lost lives. The faces of those who had vanished lingered in his mind, each one a stark reminder of his own role in their disappearance. The horrifying truth was clear now. All this time, he had believed he was merely trying to survive, but in reality, he was the one responsible for wiping everyone out. The isolation he felt was suffocating. The understanding that he was a danger to everyone around him was almost too much to bear. His attempts to reach out, to seek comfort from those he cared about, had only led to more destruction. The gravity of his situation weighed heavily on him, the realization of his own role in the calamity threatening to crush him. He tried to focus, to think of a way forward, but his thoughts were tangled in a web of despair and fear. The knowledge that he was the epicenter of this disaster, the source of the strange and deadly force, left him feeling powerless and lost. There was no escape from the reality that he was alone in this crisis, a human void in a world that seemed to be unraveling around him. The silence of the car was oppressive, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just witnessed. He knew he had to return to the lab, to confront the source of the energy and the experiments that had led to his transformation. But the fear of what might happen next, of causing more disappearances, paralyzed him. As he sat there, staring at the empty field, the enormity of his predicament became painfully clear. He had to find a way to understand and possibly reverse what had been done to him, but the path seemed insurmountable. The weight of his guilt and the fear of his own power made every decision feel impossible. In the end, the field was a stark reminder of his isolation and the terrible reality he faced. He had become a force of destruction, a living embodiment of the void, and the journey to redemption, if it even existed, was a daunting and uncertain road ahead.